Imagine a world without a single grain of salt on your table. No chips, no fries, no seasoning packet, nothing. Now imagine that for over 99% of human history, that was exactly the reality our ancestors lived in. Salt, as we know it, that little shaker sitting next to your pepper, is actually one of the newest habits in the human story, even though our bodies have craved sodium since long before we were even human at all. To understand when ancient humans first started eating salt, you actually have to go back further than humans themselves. Every animal on Earth, from the smallest rodent to the largest elephant, needs sodium to survive, since it controls nerve signals, muscle contractions, and fluid balance in the body. Our early hominin ancestors millions of years ago were getting all the sodium they needed not from seasoning their food, but simply from eating meat, blood, and organs of animals they hunted or scavenged. Raw meat is naturally salty enough to meet the body's needs without adding anything extra. This means that for the vast majority of human evolution, nobody was sprinkling salt on anything. They were just eating animals and plants that already contained the sodium they required. The real turning point, the moment historians and archaeologists point to when actual, deliberate salt use begins, happened around the time humans started shifting away from a purely hunter-gatherer lifestyle and into farming, somewhere around 8,000 years ago, give or take. Here's the problem that farming created. When you stop eating mostly meat and start eating mostly grains, vegetables, and dairy, you lose a huge chunk of your natural sodium intake, since plants simply don't carry the same salt content that animal flesh does. So, as agriculture spread across the ancient world, especially in places like China, the Middle East, and parts of Europe, people suddenly needed an outside source of sodium to stay healthy. That need is what historians believe sparked humanity's first real relationship with salt as a deliberate, sought-after substance, rather than something that just came along with dinner. One of the earliest and most fascinating pieces of evidence comes from China, where archaeologists have found remains near Lake Yuncheng in Shanxi province, suggesting that people were boiling salty lake water to extract salt as far back as 6,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest known salt production sites on the planet. This wasn't some small side project. This lake became so important that entire dynasties later fought wars and built fortified cities just to control access to it, which tells you how quickly salt went from a nice-to-have to a matter of survival and power. Around the same general era, evidence from the village of Provadia Solnitsata in modern-day Bulgaria shows that people were boiling brine from a natural spring in clay pots to produce salt cakes as early as 5,400 years before the Common Era, making this site one of Europe's oldest known salt production centers. What's wild is that this little settlement eventually grew walls, defenses, and what some archaeologists consider the earliest known prehistoric town in Europe, basically because controlling salt meant controlling wealth. That pattern of salt equals power shows up again and again across ancient civilizations once you start looking for it. The ancient Egyptians were already using salt, not just in food, but in the mummification process, by around 3,000 years before the Common Era, packing bodies in natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, to dry them out and preserve them for the afterlife. This means salt in Egypt wasn't just a kitchen ingredient. It was literally tied to religious beliefs about death and eternity. That alone shows how deeply this mineral worked its way into ancient daily life, far beyond just making food taste better. Meanwhile, over in ancient Rome, salt became so economically critical that soldiers were sometimes partially paid in salt rations. Many historians trace the origin of the English word salary directly back to the Latin word salarium, which was connected to payments related to salt. While modern historians debate the exact mechanics of how literal that connection was, the cultural association between salt, money, value, and worth stuck around in language for thousands of years afterward, which is honestly one of those little historical facts that completely changes how you look at your paycheck. Salt wasn't just valuable for taste either, and this is a detail that often gets overlooked because before refrigeration existed, salt was essentially humanity's only reliable way to preserve meat and fish for long periods of time. This meant communities living near coastlines, salt flats, or natural brine springs had a massive survival advantage, since they could store food through winters, droughts, and long voyages. This preservation power is part of why ancient trade routes formed specifically around salt, with caravans crossing the Sahara Desert carrying salt from mines in places like Tagaza in West Africa, and trading it for gold. In some periods, salt was genuinely worth its weight in gold because losing access to it could mean losing the ability to survive a hard season. By the time you get into ancient Chinese, Egyptian, Roman, and Mesopotamian records, you start seeing salt taxes, salt monopolies controlled by rulers, and entire government systems built around regulating deciding who got to produce and sell it. Historians often point to this as one of the earliest forms of large-scale economic control in human civilization, since whoever controlled the salt supply effectively controlled food preservation, trade, and to some extent, the loyalty of the population depending on them for it. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting from a biological standpoint. Some anthropologists argue that our intense craving for salty food today is basically a leftover survival instinct from this exact period in history, back when salt was scarce, hard to get, and absolutely essential. So our brains evolved to reward us heavily whenever we consumed it, the same way they reward us for sugar and fat, which were also historically rare and valuable. That craving never really turned off, even though salt today is sitting in a shaker on every table in America, dirt cheap and available in basically unlimited quantities. The instinct that once helped our ancestors survive scarcity is now, arguably, working against modern humans living in abundance, which is part of why public health officials in the United States constantly warn about excess sodium intake contributing to high blood pressure and heart disease, because our biology simply hasn't caught up to how easy salt is to get now. It's also worth mentioning that salt held deep symbolic and even spiritual meaning across nearly every ancient culture that used it. Ancient Hebrews used salt in religious offerings and covenants, the phrase covenant of salt appearing in ancient texts to represent permanence and loyalty. Many cultures developed customs and superstitions around spilling salt, sharing salt with guests, or using it in purification rituals. This shows that this mineral wasn't just functional, it carried weight, trust, and meaning in social relationships. Somewhat similar to how, today we still use phrases like being the salt of the earth, or taking something with a grain of salt, without even thinking about where those expressions originally came from. So, when you piece all of this together, the honest answer to when did ancient humans first start eating salt isn't a single, neat date you can circle on a calendar. In one sense, our ancestors were technically getting sodium from animal meat for millions of years before agriculture even existed. But the moment we usually think of as the true beginning of human salt use, the deliberate harvesting, boiling, mining, and trading of salt as its own valuable resource, really takes off somewhere between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, right around the dawn of farming societies in places like China and southeastern Europe. And from that point forward, salt didn't just season our food. It shaped trade routes, built early towns, financed soldiers, and preserved civilizations through harsh winters. It embedded itself so deeply into human culture and language that we still feel its influence every single day without even realizing it. Honestly, the next time you reach for that salt shaker at dinner, it's worth remembering. You're not just adding flavor, you're continuing a habit that quite literally helped build the foundations of human civilization itself.